Tonight, you are going to witness something that has never been shown in full. A live television broadcast from October 14th, 1982, in which Bob Ross, the man who taught America that every mistake was just a happy accident, handed a painting across a desk on national television and watched the most composed man in the history of children's television fall completely apart. And the reason Mr. Rogers covered his face and could not speak for 40 seconds was not what anyone in that studio expected. It was not grief exactly. It was not surprise exactly. It was something rarer than both of those things. It was recognition. The recognition of a secret that had been painted in plain sight for 11 years, sans broadcast into millions of living rooms every single week, hidden in the trees and the mountains and the quiet skies of a public television painting show, and never once seen for what it actually was. Until tonight, until one man looked at one canvas and understood everything. But before we get to that moment, I need to tell you something about what was happening in that studio before the cameras ever went live, because the story does not begin on October 14th, 1982. It begins 14 years earlier, in a quiet room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with two men who had no reason to know each other, and every reason, it would turn out, to never let go. It was the spring of 1968. Fred Rogers had been producing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for less than a year. The show was new, fragile, running on a budget so thin production staff sometimes brought their own supplies from home. Fred was 40 years old. He was simply a man with a profound conviction that children deserved to be spoken to honestly, gently, and with complete respect. That the interior world of a child was the most important geography that television could ever visit. He was recording an episode at WQID in Pittsburgh when a young man wandered in through the wrong door. His name was Robert Norman Ross. He was 26 years old. He had just left the United States Air Force after a career that had begun when he was 18, that had taken him to Fairbanks, Alaska, that had shaped him in ways he did not yet have language for. He was carrying a canvas bag and a set of oil painting supplies, and a look Fred Rogers would later describe, in a private letter, as the expression of a man who has come back from somewhere very far away and is not entirely sure the world he returned to is the same one he left. Bob had stumbled into the wrong building looking for an art supply store. He was lost in Pittsburgh. He had nowhere in particular to be. Fred Rogers looked up from his script. He looked at this young man with the canvas bag and the searching eyes and the quiet that surrounds people who have learned to carry enormous things without making noise about it. Fred said 3 words. "Can I help?" Bob Ross said, "I hope so." They talked for 2 hours. Fred missed the recording session. His production assistant found him sitting cross-legged on the floor of Studio A with this stranger, both of them talking the way people talk when they have stumbled into the conversation they have needed to have for years. Bob talked about Alaska, about the mountains and the way light moved across them at 4 in the morning in January, and how he had painted them obsessively for years, because painting was the only thing that made the noise stop. "What noise?" Fred asked. Bob was quiet for a long time. "The noise of who I had to be up there," he finally said. Fred Rogers did not look away. "You don't have to be that person anymore," he said. And something in Bob Ross, something that had been bracing against impact for 20 years, quietly released. Fred Rogers was the first person to tell him that the gentleness he had spent his military career suppressing was not a weakness. It was the whole point. It was the thing he was supposed to give the world. Bob started painting seriously the following year. He found his voice, that particular low, warm, unhurried voice that would become one of the most recognizable sounds in American public life. And woven into every painting he ever made was a private conversation with one person, with the man who had told him, in a studio in Pittsburgh, that the thing he had been hiding was the most important thing about him. But there was something else, something Bob Ross had never told anyone, not Fred, not his family, not the producers of The Joy of Painting. Something he had been carrying since 1971 that had never found words. Only paint, broadcast in encoded form into millions of American living rooms every single week, and never once read correctly. Until October 14th, 1982. Wait, before we get to that night, you need to understand what was at stake. What happened on the Tonight Show stage was not simply an emotional moment. It was the end of a silence that had lasted 11 years. And once you understand why, everything about Bob Ross's painting style looks completely different. Every happy little tree feels like something it always was, but that you never had the name for. In 1971, Bob Ross had a student, young boy named Daniel. He was 9 years old, enrolled in one of Bob's painting classes at a community center in Clearwater, Florida. Before the joy of painting, before anyone knew Bob's name, Daniel was the kind of student that teachers carry forever, not because he was technically gifted, though he was, but because he painted with a quality of attention unusual in a child. He looked at the world the way Bob had always wanted people to look at it, like it was worth seeing. Bob painted alongside Daniel every week for 8 months. He taught him wet on wet, how to build mountains from the base up, how to let the fan brush find the shape of a tree rather than force it. He taught him, mostly, that there was no such thing as a mistake in painting, only unexpected directions. Daniel called them happy accidents before Bob ever used that phrase publicly. A 9-year-old boy in Florida in 1971 looked at a smear on his canvas and said, in a tone of complete philosophical satisfaction, "That's just a happy accident." Bob Ross, standing behind him, realized the boy was exactly right, that the smear was better than what had been intended. The accident subset found something the plan would have missed. He used the phrase himself for the first time 3 days later. In the autumn of 1971, Daniel's family relocated suddenly, with no goodbye. 1 week he was in class. The next week his seat was empty. Bob asked at the community center. No forwarding address. Bob never heard from Daniel again. He tried to find him for years. He wrote letters that came back undeliverable. He made phone calls that rang in empty rooms. Nothing, not a word, not a trace. And so Bob did the only thing he knew how to do with something too large to carry in ordinary ways. He painted it, every week, on television. He painted the landscapes he and Daniel had painted together. The mountains, the evergreen trees that Daniel had always painted slightly leaning, as if a wind had passed through them. The small cabin Daniel had painted in his very first class, when Bob asked students to paint somewhere they felt safe, and Daniel had drawn a lit window and a frozen lake without hesitation, as if he had been there. He painted that cabin in nearly every episode of The Joy of Painting he ever made. He called the trees happy accidents, and he held the brush the way he had held it, when he was teaching a 9-year-old boy how to make the world look beautiful. He never told a single person. Fred Rogers suspected something. He had watched Bob paint on television long enough to notice the cabin appearing in episode after episode. Always the same position in the composition, always the same lit window, the same frozen lake. He had noticed that Bob's voice changed slightly whenever he painted it. A small softening, almost imperceptible. The kind of change that happens when a person is thinking about something they are not saying. But Fred never pushed, because Fred Rogers understood, better than almost anyone alive, that some things have to come up on their own time when the person carrying them is finally ready to put them down. But what Fred had never told Bob, what he had held quietly for 10 years, was this. In 1972, Fred had received a letter at WQED from a woman who signed only her first initial. She said her son had been in a painting class in Florida, and the teacher there had given him the same thing Fred spent his career giving to children: permission to be exactly who he was. She said her spoke about this teacher more than anyone else in his life. They had moved suddenly, she wrote, and she had never had the chance to go back and say thank you. She had enclosed a painting. Her son had made it. He was 9 years old. A mountain landscape, evergreen trees, slightly leaning, a sky going from deep blue through lavender to amber, a small cabin, a lit window, a frozen lake, painted, unmistakably, in the vocabulary of someone, taught by someone who painted mountains as if they were friends. The boy's name his mother had written was Daniel. Fred had written back to the address on the envelope. The letter was returned undeliverable. And so for 10 years, Fred had done what Bob was doing on the other side of the same silence. He had read the letter once a year. He had watched Bob paint that cabin every week and said nothing, because he did not yet have enough. He had a name. He had a painting. He did not have a way to complete the circle, until 18 months before October 14, 1982, when a second letter arrived at his W office. From the same woman, this time with her full name. Her son was now 20 years old. He was studying art in Cleveland. He still watched The Joy of Painting every week. He still called happy accidents, happy accidents. She wanted Fred to know, if he ever crossed paths with the man who had taught him, that her son was well. Fred Rogers held that letter for 18 months, waiting for the right moment. On October 13th, 1982, The Tonight Show called to confirm the booking. Fred confirmed. Then he took the original letter from 1972 and placed it inside a fresh envelope. On the front, in his precise, unhurried handwriting, he wrote one word, Bob. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his cardigan. The next morning, he drove to the airport. October 14th, 1982, NBC Studios, Burbank, The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson had been hosting for 20 years. He had interviewed presidents, film stars, musicians, athletes, scientists, comedians, and every variety of human being the 20th century had produced. He had maintained his composure through revelations, through tears, through laughter. So extreme it required commercial breaks to recover from. He was the most experienced interviewer in the history of American television. He was not prepared for tonight. The show was scheduled to feature Bob Ross and Mr. Rogers as a joint appearance, a booking the producers had described as America's two gentlest men in the same chair. Easy television. The canvas Bob Ross had brought changed everything about what easy television was going to mean. Johnny Carson's monologue that night was sharp. Political jokes, observation comedy, the usual machinery of late night at full efficiency. The studio lights burned their particular shade of 1982 amber. Everything exactly as it always was. Backstage in the green room, Bob Ross sat with his canvas across his knees and said almost nothing. He had arrived 2 hours early. What nobody backstage understood was that Bob was not there to prepare. He was there because he did not know what to do with the time before. The moment he had been building toward for 11 years. Fred Rogers arrived at 5:02. He walked down the backstage corridor, past the canvas propped against the green room wall, and stopped. He stood in front of it for a long time, his face completely still, the face of someone who has just seen something they have been expecting, without knowing it. When he walked in and sat beside Bob, neither of them spoke. Fred reached over and put his hand on Bob's arm. Bob looked at the canvas. Fred looked at Bob. The stage manager knocked at 6:04, 5 minutes. Bob Ross stood and picked up the canvas, holding it face inward against his chest. He looked at Fred. "I think I need to tell them," Bob said. Fred Rogers looked at his friend for a long moment. "I know," Fred said. "I've known for a while." "How long?" Bob asked. Fred smiled very quietly. Since the second season, Bob absorbed this. He said nothing. He walked toward the stage entrance. Fred followed. "What you are about to see has never been shown in full. The cameras caught it. The audio caught all of it. But the full accounting, the 14 years of friendship, the 11 years of hidden grief, the letter carried in a cardigan pocket for 10 years, none of that had been told. Until now." Ed McMahon's voice rolled through the studio like a warm tide. "Ladies and gentlemen, two men who have brought more genuine comfort to American living rooms than any other figures in the history of public television. Please welcome Bob Ross and Fred Rogers." The audience responded the way audiences respond when they see people they love. Not the electric surge of celebrity recognition. Something softer, more like relief. Like seeing two faces that mean the world is still. In some corners, it's a safe place. Bob Ross walked out first, his familiar dark shirt, his familiar halo of hair. He carried the canvas at his side, face turned inward. The production assistant had offered to set it on an easel, but Bob had declined. He was holding on to it. Fred Rogers followed, in his cardigan, the blue one, the one generations of children had associated with being told you were exactly enough, just as you were. He walked with his characteristic unhurried calm, the walk of a man who believed that wherever he was going would still be there when he arrived. Johnny Carson stood as they approached. He shook Bob's hand, then Fred's, then looked at the canvas. His eyes paused on it a second longer than courtesy required. "What have you brought us tonight, Bob?" Johnny asked. "Something I painted this morning," Bob said. "I'd like to show it at the end, if that's all right." Johnny looked at the covered canvas, then at Fred Rogers, already seated with his hands folded in his lap, and an expression that was, for Fred Rogers, unusually still. Not the warm animation of a man happy to be somewhere. The stillness of a man who is waiting. Johnny had done this long enough to know when something was already in motion. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." The first 20 minutes were everything the producers had hoped for. Johnny asked Bob about the origins of the joy of painting. The Alaska years, the loneliness of Fairbanks in midwinter, how painting had kept the silence from becoming unbearable. He asked Fred about the neighborhood, about the trolley, about the conviction that had driven him to believe television could be something other than a collection of people throwing pies at each other. The audience laughed. Johnny laughed. Fred smiled. Then, Johnny asked the question that changed everything. He asked it casually, in a tone that sounds like an afterthought, like something that will pass without much weight. He had no way of knowing what it would open. "Bob," he said, "who did you first teach to paint?" The studio went quiet. Bob Ross looked at the canvas sitting face down on the desk. Fred Rogers looked at Bob. "A student," Bob said, "a long time ago." Johnny waited. He had been in this chair for 20 years. He knew how to wait. "How long ago?" he asked. 11 years, Bob said. Something in his voice made the studio change, not loudly. The way temperature changes. You don't hear it. You just feel the room become something different. "Tell me about them," Johnny said. And Bob Ross did something he had never done on television in his entire career. He stopped smiling. Not with grief, not with drama. He simply let his face become what it actually was. And what it actually was in that moment was the face of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just decided, in the space of a single breath, to put it down. His name was Daniel, Bob said. He was 9 years old. He took my class in Florida, 1971. The studio was completely still. I taught him for 8 months. He had a way of looking at things. Not just painting things. Looking at the world. Like he could see that everything in it was already beautiful, if you knew how to look. You ever meet a child like that? He looked at Johnny. Johnny nodded. He had stopped moving entirely. He called them happy accidents before I did, Bob said. I want you to know that. He said it first. A 9-year-old boy in Florida in 1971 looked at a smear on his canvas and said that's just a happy accident. And I don't think I ever said anything more true in my life than what I said back. What did you say back? Johnny asked quietly. You're right, Bob said. That's exactly right. The simplicity of it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward through the silence. What happened to him? Johnny asked. His family moved, Bob said suddenly. I don't know why. I never found out. 1 week he was there. The next week his seat was empty. He paused. I tried to find him for a long time. Eventually I found the only way I knew how to keep looking. He picked up the canvas. He turned it toward the audience. The painting was, at first glance, exactly what anyone would expect from Bob Ross. A mountain landscape. Evergreen trees slightly leaning, as if a wind had passed through them. A sky from deep blue through lavender to amber. A small cabin in the middle distance. A frozen lake catching the last light. Beautiful. Familiar. The visual language millions had come to associate with Sunday afternoons. And the feeling that the world was fundamentally all right. And then Fred Rogers leaned forward in his chair, and Fred Rogers went very still. And then Fred Rogers covered his face with both hands. The studio caught it immediately. The camera operator moved in on instinct. The audience went quiet. Fred Rogers sat with his face in his hands for 40 seconds. He did not make any sound. His shoulders were not shaking. He was not performing grief. He was simply, for 40 seconds, unavailable to the world. Johnny Carson looked at Bob Ross. Bob Ross was watching Fred. Fred, Johnny said gently. Fred, are you all right? Fred Rogers lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were wet. The expression of a man who has just been handed something he had not known he had been waiting for. He looked at the painting. Then he looked at Bob. The cabin, Fred said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Bob nodded. The cabin in Daniel's first painting, Fred said. Bob nodded again. The audience did not understand. 22 million people watching at home did not understand. But something in the exchange between these two men, the certainty in Fred's recognition, the relief in Bob's acknowledgement, made understanding unnecessary. The room could feel that something true had been spoken. That was enough. Tell me, Johnny said. Tell us what we're looking at. Fred Rogers lowered his hands to his lap. He sat for a moment. Then he looked at the audience. In 1968, he said, I met Bob Ross for the first time. He had just left the Air Force. He was lost in Pittsburgh, looking for a building he couldn't find. He found me instead. We talked for a long time about what it means to make something, about why a person picks up a brush. Fred looked at Bob. Bob told me something that day I have thought about every year since. He told me the mountains in Alaska had been his friends when he had no other friends, that he painted them every morning because they were the only thing that was always exactly what they appeared to be. Nothing hidden, nothing pretending. Just the mountain, in the light, being itself. Johnny was listening with the particular stillness he reserved for. Moments he understood, instinctively, were larger than the broadcast. I recognize that longing, Fred continued. The longing for something that doesn't require you to perform. I have spent my career trying to give children permission to be exactly who they are. And here was this young man who had spent 20 years learning the same lesson from mountains. In 1972, I received a letter from a woman. She said her son had been in a painting class in Florida, and the teacher had given him permission to be exactly who he was. They had moved suddenly, and she had never had the chance to say thank you. The silence in the studio had become total. She sent me a painting, Fred said. Her son had made it. A mountain landscape, evergreen trees, a sky going from blue to lavender to amber, a small cabin in the middle distance, a frozen lake. He looked at the canvas Bob was holding. Her son's name was Daniel. Bob Ross looked down at the painting in his hands. For 11 years, Fred said, I have been trying to find a way to tell you that he was all right, that he remembered you, that what you gave him, the happy accidents, the permission to see the world as beautiful, he carried all of it. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She told me in the letter that he was well, that he was painting still, that he said, sometimes when he looked at the canvas, he heard your voice telling him there were no mistakes. Bob Ross set the painting down on the desk, carefully, the way you set down something that has held enormous weight and needs to be rested. Then Bob Ross put his hands over his eyes. For 30 seconds, while 22 million people watched and no one in the studio made a sound, Bob Ross stayed in that private darkness behind his own hands. Johnny Carson did not speak. He did not move toward commercial. He did what Fred Rogers had spent his career asking adults to do for children. He waited. He let the moment be exactly what it was. When Bob lowered his hands, his eyes were red. He looked at Fred. He tried to say something and could not immediately. He looked at the painting. Then he looked at Johnny. I painted it every week, Bob said. His voice was rough. Different from the television voice, softer, without the performance of calm. Every week for 11 years, I painted something from the class. I just needed somewhere to put it. And painting was where I put things I couldn't carry any other way. Johnny's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. Why didn't you tell anyone? He asked. Who do you tell something like that? Bob said. That you miss a 9-year-old boy you knew for 8 months 11 years ago? That every painting you've ever made is underneath the mountains and the trees? A conversation with someone who's not there? He paused. You don't say that on television. Except tonight, Johnny said. Bob looked at him. Except tonight, he said. Fred Rogers leaned forward slightly. Daniel is 20 now, he said. His mother wrote to me again 18 months ago. He studies art. He teaches, sometimes, at a community level. She told me that when he watches The Joy of Painting, he can still hear Bob's voice telling him there are no mistakes. Only happy accidents, Bob Ross laughed. It came out of him suddenly, completely unexpectedly, not the warm television chuckle, but a real laugh. The laugh of someone who has just been relieved of something very heavy and does not quite know what to do with the sudden lightness. Fred Rogers smiled, and it was the smile, that specific, complete, unguarded smile, that the cameras had been trying to capture for decades and had only ever gotten partial approximations of. The real thing. Here in this studio, on this night, the studio audience, silent for nearly 5 minutes, began to applaud. Not the climactic applause of entertainment. The applause of people who have witnessed something they did not expect to witness. The applause of release. Johnny Carson turned to the camera. We're going to take a short break, he said. And when we come back, Bob Ross is going to paint something live. Because I think we all need to see how a happy accident looks when it's made by someone who knows what it costs. The commercial break lasted 4 minutes. Nobody rushed it. When the cameras went back live, Bob Ross had set up an easel, a fresh canvas. The paints were arranged, the brushes in their order. The studio had quieted into the particular attentive hush of people who understand they are about to witness something that belongs to a different category than entertainment. Johnny sat at his desk. Fred sat in his chair, hands folded, watching. Bob picked up his palette knife. This is going to be a mountain, he said. The mountain I first painted when I got to Alaska. The first winter morning I woke up early enough to see it before the light changed. He loaded the knife with titanium white. I was 20 years old. I was scared, very far from anywhere I'd ever been. And I walked outside at 4 in the morning, and I looked at this mountain, and it was just exactly itself. Not trying to be anything, not performing anything. Just a mountain in the winter light. He began to work. The knife moved in the fast, sure strokes anyone who had watched The Joy of Painting would recognize. The sky came first, that luminous, pale winter sky, the color of something about to begin. "You know what I tell people," Bob said, his voice back in its familiar register. That warm, unhurried quality that had accompanied millions of people through Sunday afternoons. "I tell them there are no mistakes, only happy accidents. People think that's just something nice to say, something encouraging." He pulled the brush down for the first tree. "It's not," he said. "It's the most literally true thing I know. Because what makes a happy accident? A happy accident isn't that the mistake disappeared. It's that you looked at it and found what it was actually trying to be. And you followed that instead of fighting it." Fred Rogers was watching Bob paint with an expression of complete peace. His hands were folded in his lap. He was simply there, the way he had always been simply there for the people he cared about. "I had a teacher," Bob said, "who told me something when I was still in the Air Force. He said the world already knows how to be beautiful. Your job isn't to tell it how. Your job is to pay enough attention to see it." He added the mountain, broad knife strokes, building the shape from nothing, the white and gray and pale violet emerging as if they had always been there. "I have tried to pay attention," he said, "every week, for 11 years, to what was in front of me, and to what wasn't there anymore, but still somehow was. Daniel taught me that. Before I taught him anything about painting, he showed me how to look. 9 years old, and he already knew the most important thing. He added the cabin, the suggestion of a window lit from inside." Fred Rogers made a small sound, not a word. Just a sound. The kind a person makes when something that has been almost said for a very long time finally finds its form. Bob turned and looked at Fred. "You kept his letter all this time," Bob said. Fred nodded. "Can I have it?" Bob asked. "Someday, when you're ready to give it up." Fred Rogers reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan. He pulled out an envelope, worn at the corners. The paper softened from handling. On the front, in a child's handwriting, was a single word: Bob. Fred set it on the desk in front of Bob Ross. "I've been carrying it for 10 years, he said, "waiting for the right moment to give it to you." Bob Ross looked at the envelope. He did not open it. He picked it up and held it in both hands, the way you hold something simultaneously fragile and impossibly full. "I'll read it tonight," Bob said, "when I'm alone." Fred Rogers nodded. "That's the right time," he said. Johnny Carson had not spoken for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was stripped of the professional warmth, the practiced ease. Just a voice. "I've done this job for 20 years, he said. "I have sat in this chair and talked to thousands of people, and tried, every night, to find the thing that was real under everything else. Tonight, 2 of you just handed me the whole thing. No searching required." He looked at the painting on the easel. "Is there something hidden in this one?" Johnny asked. "The way there was in the other?" Bob Ross looked at the fresh canvas. "In every one," he said. "If you know what you're looking at." Johnny nodded. Then he turned to the camera. "You've been watching The Tonight Show," he said. "But I want you to know something about what just happened here. This isn't a television moment. This is what television is supposed to be for. 2 men who changed how America feels about itself, not by being loud or extraordinary, by being quiet and honest and present, by paying attention, by deciding that the world deserved to be looked at carefully." He turned back to Bob and Fred. "I'm grateful you came tonight. I'm grateful you brought the painting. And I'm grateful that you trusted us with the thing that was hidden in it." Bob Ross looked at Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers looked at Bob Ross. And in the silence that followed, the silence of a studio in which something true had been said and held, 22 million people sat in their living rooms and felt, without being able to say exactly why, that the world was a little less alone than it had seemed an hour ago. After the broadcast, NBC's switchboard received over 40,000 calls before midnight, not from fans of either man, from people who wanted to say they had a Daniel of their own, a student, a child, a friend, a teacher, someone who had shaped them and disappeared without a proper goodbye, someone they had been carrying quietly for years. The painting Bob Ross made that night was donated to a school art program the following spring. The school was in Ohio. Nobody ever fully explained how that happened. Bob Ross completed 31 seasons of The Joy of Painting, 403 episodes. In nearly every one, look carefully at the trees in the foreground, at the way the fan brush comes down and finds the shape that was already there. And you can hear him telling a 9-year-old boy in Florida that there are no mistakes. Only happy accidents. Fred Rogers kept the second letter in the same box where he kept the things that mattered most. When he gave the first letter to Bob, the anniversary passed for the first time in 10 years without wait. Johnny Carson retired in 1992. In the catalog of his most important broadcasts, he listed October 14, 1982 near the top. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Bob Ross passed away on July 4, 1995. He was 52 years old. Among his personal effects, his family found two things on his nightstand: a worn envelope and a small painting of a mountain in winter, a cabin with a lit window, a sky going from blue to lavender to amber. On the back, in Bob's handwriting, 3 words: he was here. If this story stayed with you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person who changed how you see the world without knowing they were doing it. The teacher, the friend, the stranger on a particular afternoon. The one you never properly thanked. The one you've been carrying quietly in the way you look at something and find it beautiful without knowing why. Find a way to tell them. You don't need a canvas. You just need the words. Because somewhere right now, someone painted a mountain for 11 years, hoping you'd see it. Let them know you looked. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who has a Daniel they haven't spoken about yet. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and who you've been carrying. Because the most important thing Bob Ross ever said had nothing to do with painting. There are no mistakes, only happy accidents. Where are you watching from? Tell me below.